Oops, I did not want to do that. Sorry about that. Thought I was clicking something different. Too many screens.
So many pop-ups with the Zoom.
There are. And they don't necessarily line up to the way my screen lines up. All right, if you are a teacher, please identify yourself to us. We see 3 that we know, but Ms. Smith, Ms. Wakefield, and Ms. Waltcott are here. If there's somebody else here we didn't catch that's a teacher, if you'll please send a chat either to me or Ms. Waddell, that would be very helpful. All right. So it is 4 o'clock. I'm going to start right on time because I want to respect your time. My name is Kelly Self. I am a teacher at Hoover High School in the Birmingham area, and I will be assisted tonight by Kate Waddell. She is a teacher at Pike Road High School. I was getting just a brain block.
Everybody gets it mixed up with my last school because they sound so similar.
There you go. And so if you are not logged into the Pear Deck, that is joinpd.com. and then KYADIG. And that code, I'm going to close this in just a second. That code's going to reside up in the upper right-hand corner of the Pear Deck. So if something happens and you get kicked out, you can get back in very easily. We will have some opportunities in today's. We're going to write like we always do, but you'll also have some opportunities today to just kind of chat with us. We'll ask some questions, and when we do, you can either unmute yourself or you can put it into the chat, but I hope you will interact with us. Today's topic is, oh, Miss Bobo is here also, Miss Waddell. Yeah. Today's topic is policy making. All right. And we have had a session on policy making before. Excuse me. The second session we did in November talked really about the legislative aspect of policy. And we're going to hit the high points on that. This is from Unit 2. And then we're going to talk tonight also about the executive branch and its portion in policy making. And then you guys have one more session, I think, before we finish this series. And then you also have AP Palooza in April. And our 5th session of these Zoom meetings will deal with the judicial branch and the court cases. Okay, so we will go through all 3 branches before we're done. So your question here, describe who is most influential in policy making. What I'm looking for in a response to this, it says describe. So I'm wanting you to choose a branch and then describe sort of what their part of the process would be. If you're making a judgment that they're the most influential, then you would need to give a reason why they're the most influential or how they're the most influential. So let me see, some of you were writing. I'm going to give you a second. Those of you that just got into the Pear Deck, I'll give you a second to do some more writing while I admit a few latecomers too. For those of you that are popping in late, we are in Pear Deck. You go to joinpd.com, and then that code is up in the upper right-hand corner for you.
I'll repost the code in the chat also.
Okay, thank you. And I'm pausing because I'm reading what you guys are writing. And I think if I were taking a poll here, we would have to say that a large number of you are choosing the legislative branch, just a few choosing the executive branch, but just to give a couple of good samples. So we have the legislative branch is most influential in policymaking in America. You kind of restated the prompt, which is great. Since this branch is composed of members that represent the people in a representative democracy, and most of the policies made in this government reflect democracy. Okay, so you've chosen a branch and you've described the fact that the legislative branch is most representative of the people. Okay, there's another Congress. Congress is the most influential group of policymakers in the US, but they are balanced out by both the executive and legislative branch. The president isn't as powerful because his policy can quickly be undone by his successor. The legislative branch has the exclusive ability to effectively create federal laws in the federal government and can override presidential vetoes if the conditions are right. So you not only made a choice, you then said why the other one wasn't, and sort of gave an example of that checks and balances, which is great. Here's a president.
I liked this one because they went a different route than everyone.
Okay, there you go. As the head of the executive branch, the president plays a crucial role in setting the policy agenda and guiding the development and implementation of policies. That is a completely different, and he does set that agenda. And we've got somebody adding to their answer. All right, so there are, a second to add to that answer, but we're going to move on. This course is organized around 5 big ideas, okay? And 2 of those big ideas really very directly hinge on policymaking. One of those is constitutionalism, the fact that our system is based on a written constitution of limited government, and the other that there are competing policymaking interests involved in the policymaking program. In the policymaking process. So here's some big questions, and these are in your course and exam description as sort of big questions that you should consider. You know, which branch of government is the most powerful? So that was sort of a variation of what I just asked you, asking you which one's most influential. So, you know, which is most powerful, and be able to explain why. Are there really checks and balances when one political party controls all 3 branches of government? Why or why not? And of course, that question would also connect to one of our documents. It would connect to which document talks about checks and balances, actually. You guys will pop in either into the chat or answer. Feel free to tell me which document talked about checks and balances. And then under competing policymaking interests, in what ways has the evolution of government powers affected Americans and their daily lives? So that's a big idea that would lend itself, I think, really well also to like the quantitative analysis question. They might give you a chart that shows you a trend over time or a change over time, because you know, how has that growth of government power affected Americans and their daily lives? Don't see anybody throwing anything in the chat for me. So my question was about this second one. Are there really checks and balances when one political party controls all 3 branches of government? And I asked you which of your foundational documents would be most closely related to that. And the answer would be Federalist 51, where we took the ideas of Montesquieu and they wrote that out in that Federalist document and described separation of powers and checks and balances. That is something you're going to need to know. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind that connects there. All right, so let's review Congress's powers just briefly. And I'm making an assumption here, and they know, you know what they say when you assume, but I am assuming that even if you're in a 1 semester class that's just in the spring, that you are into Unit 2 by now, if your teacher's going through the units in order, okay? If they're going out of order, you might not be, but if you're going in order, I'm going to assume that you're there. So Congress's powers are in the Constitution. The expressed powers, those powers that say what they expressly can do, are predominantly found in Article 1, Section 8. And I'll just throw out the question again. You guys can throw an answer in the chat for me. You know, what is an example of an expressed power of Congress? You know, which ones can you remember? Because you might need to call some of those to mind when you're writing on this test or even answering multiple choice questions. So the expressed powers are the ones that are specifically and expressly stated in the Constitution. The implied powers, we get that from the word implied. Implied means not expressly stated. And authority for implied powers of Congress are also in Article 1, Section 8 at the very end with the necessary and proper clause, or what we also call the elastic clause. Okay, I've got something in here. There we go. The ability to mint money. In the Constitution, it calls it coining money, but yes, the ability to create currency for the country. That is an expressed power. Thank you, Dylan.
I was going to say something that I use in my class to help my students remember kind of what the elastic clause does with implied powers. Is I always tell them to think of it like a rubber band. So they're stretching their powers out just like you can stretch a rubber band out.
That's right, because it's elastic. I'm older than you. I think about, you know, the elastic in pants when my kids were little. I loved to get them the jeans that had that little bit of elastic that would give me a little bit longer for them to wear them, assuming they didn't shoot up in height. Because clothes are expensive as a parent when you got multiple children, particularly. Yeah, that's why that's the other term is elastic clause, because like a rubber band or like a piece of elastic, it lets it stretch. Okay. The authority to make laws that says they will write laws, that's part of what the legislative branch does, is also in Article 1. And in Section 7, they talk about one specific type of bill that must originate in the House, and that is a revenue bill. Now, revenue is money. Okay, so this is talking about that power of the purse. It's talking about taxation. Now, it is an expressed power. The very first power listed in the Constitution is that power to tax in Article 1, Section 8. But in Article 1, Section 7, they put a specific other parameter on that. And that is that the House must originate those bills. And why? Keep in mind, always remember, the House is proportional. It's larger than the other because it's based on population. And the members of the House of Representatives have always been chosen by members of the House. You know, we don't like taxes. That's just general human nature. But this country was founded on the idea in part that we didn't like taxes, that we didn't have some voice in seeing them passed on and implemented on us. And so they put it in the people's house, that those bills have to start there. All bills, however, have to pass through both houses. And that description is also in Article 1, Section 7, that all bills passed by both houses are then presented to the president for his approval or rejection. So there we see both that separation of powers and that checks and balances. They can also pass what are called resolutions. Resolutions are matters that are not laws. So, you know, what kinds of things would be in a resolution instead of a bill? That would include things like constitutional amendments. War declarations are passed as resolutions. Admitting a new state could be done through a resolution, particularly when they set conditions on states for admission. They'll do that as a resolution. So there are things that don't automatically become law just because Congress and the president sign them. They are going to require some other action. So for instance, amendments, you know, have to also be ratified by the states in addition. Okay. While war is also very significant, obviously, that's not a law. It's an action that's taking place, hopefully for a very limited period of time. All right. And then Article 1, Section 7 also talks about the ability of overriding a presidential veto. So if the president vetoes and 2/3 of each house agrees, they can override his veto and still pass that law. The War Powers Act, which is in your curriculum, is a good example of a bill that was passed with a veto override because President Nixon vetoed it and Congress, both parties, overrode his veto in both houses. It's not a very effective law, but it's a good example of a veto override. Now, language that's used in this test is also important. And I will tell you, if you're jotting down notes while you're attending this, Congress enacts policy. So that word enact, E-N-A-C-T, is a piece of that's a vocabulary term that gets used in the test. And that's that process of like writing a law is enactment. And that's what Congress does most of the time. The president implements or enforces. So there's a different piece of vocabulary. And I like to stress that vocab because I was scoring the exam. Gosh, this was probably around 2016 or so. It was before we redesigned the exam. I was scoring a question and they used that language. I'm sorry, no, it was 2013. I remember exactly when it was. They used that language of enact and implement in different parts of a free response. And kids basically knew what it was, but they didn't necessarily know it by that language. And so you had responses that their overall response knew that they probably knew the answer, but they didn't get points because they didn't answer the right things correctly. And was super frustrating to me scoring it because I thought, oh gosh, I bet they know a whole lot more than they're giving me here. And as a teacher, it frustrated me because I thought, I don't think I've used this language, not this really specific language. So when they talk about enactment, they're talking about the passing of policy or the kind of the writing of policy, normally done by the Congress, but can occasionally be done by the president. It's like if the president uses an executive order in a way that creates something new, where he's almost acting like Congress, he's enacting policy. Okay, though most of the time that's not what he's doing. All right. Let's have a little practice here, get you guys something to do. So down the center of this slide are some of those expressed powers of Congress. On the sides are some policies and programs that Congress has passed using the elastic clause, so stretching those expressed powers. So I want you to either draw a line from the program to the power or the powers that it would be stretching, or you can do dots or, whichever way, whatever color coding system you want to use, or like I said, you can just draw lines, but connect the power to the way that it's been stretched. And for some of these, there's more than one correct answer. And if you don't know what some of these things are, feel free to ask us. So for instance, selective service system is the registration system for a draft, if you didn't know that. And if you are a male who is 17 years or older, you need to register. sss.gov. I'll give you guys another minute. So I've seen a few changes made as you give something some more thought. All right, so I defined what the selective service system was. And that is, if it's going to do a draft, it's obviously the power to raise an army and a navy, an air force, a Marines, whatever branch of the military is necessary in a time of war. I guess we could do it during peace too, but there would be a huge hue and cry by the public if they did that. The space program, I actually have just added one of these to it, okay? Because this was not true until recently, but the most immediate one, because I use this slide in my classroom with my students to promote science and useful arts. Okay, so the space program, there are so many things that have come from the space program, including Velcro, if you didn't know it. Tang, do they even sell Tang anymore? I'm showing my age here, probably. There are all kinds of like food items in the 60s that
I wish.
like this, the astronauts eat this or drink this. So we thought it was cool. Dippin' Dots are one of those, actually, freeze-dried ice cream. They do still have that, I know. And so to promote science and useful arts in the space program, and of course, war powers, because it arose during the Cold War. But during the Trump administration, we also had the creation of the Space Force. So those of you who might be located up in the Huntsville area, they were going to base it at NASA up in Huntsville. So I would, if we're going to have a whole branch of the military devoted to it, it's also now tied to raise an army and a navy. Okay, so there's a program and a series of policy areas that are linked to 3 different of there's only 17 expressed powers. So it's linked to 3 of them. That's almost 20%. That's a really good ratio. The interstate highway system created during the Eisenhower administration for 2 reasons. One is to regulate commerce, okay, because most goods in this country, they don't travel by train anymore, and it's very expensive to send them by plane. They go on big trucks across the interstate system. It was also tied to war powers, however. Eisenhower was a general in World War II. He'd observed the Autobahn. We can say Hitler was horrible, Germany was horrible, but they had built a good road system. And our soldiers saw that road system and said, oh, that would be very efficient for troop movement. Okay. And so it's really ostensibly tied to 2 different powers there of Congress. Drug laws, obviously, if you're trafficking in drugs, you're moving them more than likely over state lines at some point in the process. That their ability to write laws about that, you can tie that to their power to regulate commerce. You can actually also tie it to their ability to punish piracy. It might seem funny to us in the 21st century that to punish piracy is one of those expressed powers, but that was like yo ho ho and a bottle of rum kind of pirates. That was, the kind they were still dealing with in the 1780s. But we deal with other kinds of pirates. We do. Internet piracy, it's theft of intellectual property. I tried to use the example with my students and it fell flat because I keep forgetting I'm getting older and my students are getting younger. But a big thing in like the 90s was music sharing platforms like Napster, where people uploaded their CDs and their music and people could share it freely. And the music companies are like, whoa, wait a minute, we're losing an awful lot of profit here. That's piracy. It's not a drug law, obviously, but it's another good example of piracy. And so they cracked down on that and wrote laws to make sure that was specifically forbidden because it is theft of somebody else's goods. Our civil rights laws, most of them are tied through the elastic clause to the commerce clause. So you saw instances where businesses that operated over state lines were refusing service to minorities, and Congress wrote laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and others to stop those sorts of actions. There are some that obviously challenged their ability to write those laws, and they tied it to their power to regulate commerce. And then Medicare, healthcare for the elderly. If you have a job, if you're like most Americans, you probably don't look at all the minute detail on your pay stub. I know mine is automatically deposited into my bank account now, and so I very rarely look at my pay stubs anymore. But one line item in there is a Medicare tax that we pay. So all of us who are working pay that tax to help support that Medicare system of healthcare for the elderly. So all of these are good examples of ways Congress can stretch its powers. It just has to come back and connect directly to an expressed power. And it has to be a direct enough connection that it's not going to be overturned by the courts. You know, one of your cases in Unit 1, US v. Lopez, Congress tried to stretch their commerce power in order to regulate that Gun-Free School Zones Act. And the Supreme Court said, no, you didn't make a close enough connection. Okay, so they do still have to, they can stretch their powers, but they've got to connect it back to something legitimate. Okay. And I hope if you guys have questions along the way, you're going to either unmute yourself and ask, because I'm pretty laid back about that in my teaching style, or you're going to put it into the chat and ask us questions. You can also write them down. If I say anything that contradicts something you've heard before, or that you have a question about, your teachers will also be happy to straighten out anything I might say that's wrong, because I'm not perfect, and I will not say that I won't ever make a mistake. All right, so let's talk about the president. The president is his job description is in Article 2 of the Constitution. And his job description is much more vaguely stated than Congress's is. Congress, the vesting clause at the beginning of Article 1 was all legislative powers herein granted are vested in a Congress. So they were saying, we're going to write down exactly what you can do. When you get to Article 2, it's executive power shall be vested in a president. That's not nearly as specific. And then his job comes about in a way that it's more like a description of sort of roles that he'll play, more than specific powers like in Congress's, sort of grant of power there in the Constitution. But important in Article 2, Section 1 at the end, Clause 7, is his oath of office, which includes that he will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Okay. I would tell you that maybe you should think a little bit about what does it mean to faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States. One characteristic I think that needs to include is energy. As Hamilton told us in one of our documents, I'm going to give you guys a chance again here on documents. Anybody remember which Federalist paper describes the executive branch and the expectations for what an executive would do? Feel free to stick that into the chat for me. Why did they give the president such broader, more interpretable, that's not a word, is it? Easily interpreted sort of powers? Well, partially
open-ended.
That's right, much more open-ended, better word, thank you. They wanted him to have that energy to respond to crises in the country, but they also wanted him, by his very nature, he is executing or implementing laws passed by Congress. You just gave Congress a stretch power. He's got to be able to respond in the enforcement based on what they wrote. So his job in many respects is responsive to what they do. And so that's one really good explanation for why his powers are not as strictly described as Congresses are, because he's going to be responsive to what they do. Nobody has put something in the chat. So I was talking about Federalist 70, written by Hamilton, where he talked about how the president needed to have that energy and needed to be responsive. And that's an important document that you need to know as well. Now, what are some specific things the Constitution says he can do? In Article 2, Section 2, it says he will appoint the heads of executive departments and of federal judges. So there we're talking about his cabinet and the federal judiciary. That is not an unchecked power. He does it with the advice and consent of the Senate. And so there we've got that Federalist 51 again. We've got that checks and balances going on, that he can appoint the people he thinks are best for that. But then the Senate can refuse the people that he sends over. And every president has had at least one appointment of some kind that they have sent over that the Senate has said, no, we don't want this person for whatever reason. None of them have ever had a complete and total pass. Well, maybe Washington did, but in the modern era, presidents don't get a complete pass. Both parties, particularly if the other other party is in control of the Senate, they have to be much more careful and moderate their choices. Remember, one of those first questions back near the beginning about constitutionalism was, let me look it up exactly, was, are there really checks and balances when one political party controls all three branches of government? There was a question in the 2020 exam where they wanted, one of the concept application questions asked about whether, what happens when a different party controls the Senate from the party of the president. And it was getting to this whole checks and balances aspect, and how he might have to choose different people than he would choose if his party controlled the Senate, because there's a little bit more checks and balances going on when the other party's in control and not just your party in control. And I have seen that on some other questions. I've been doing a little looking through AP Classroom, and I've seen that kind of a question. I've in a quantitative data question 2. I've seen that kind of checks and balances with regard to the parties and the president in an argumentative. So that's a really important concept to keep in your head, is to think about. And I know you guys probably haven't gotten to Unit 5 yet, where we're going to talk about political parties. But if you're paying attention to what's going on around you and you're talking about what the president can and can't do, those checks and balances are important. And there's a little aspect of common sense to think that if the other, living in this hyper partisan era that we live in, it surrounds us, sort of what I consider sort of toxic partisanship, that the other party is always going to check the opposite party, sometimes to an extent that is more political than constitutional. Now, how can the president, how can he influence policymaking? We talked about the agenda setting aspect of it earlier, and that State of the Union message is one way that the president tries to set that agenda. He's got an audience of Congress, and more importantly, the US public and the world, because they televise it, to say, this is what I would like to see Congress accomplish so that I can meet these promises I might have made when I was being elected, or just problems that have arisen, and here's the solution I think we ought to have. So he makes that suggestion. And that State of the Union message, it does not have to be in person and streaming on all channels where you have to watch it. The first presidents wrote a letter, but there is a requirement that they have to give a message about what is the State of the Union. That's intended for them to communicate with Congress about how they're implementing laws and what the results of that implementation are. He can recommend measures to Congress for legislation. That might include pulling the leaders of Congress over for lunch at the White House and talking to them, or it, could happen in other ways. And then, of course, that same clause that's up in the oath of office, he's supposed to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. He has some discretion He has some ability to decide how he implements laws, but he is in the end supposed to make sure that they are faithfully executed, that he's working towards, at least in his judgment, what the best interests of the country are. And I think generally speaking, we don't have to worry about that. People that get to that level, generally speaking, they're at least operating on what their vision of the best thing is, though that may or may not meet all of ours. And then we have the checks and balances of elections if we don't think that they actually were working to the best after all. All right, presidents are assisted by the bureaucracy. Okay, and the bureaucracy seems at sometimes like almost like that's another branch. They're not, they're part of the executive branch. So this is not a great graphic as far as being super pristinely clean for us to read all these words, but it is a good organizational chart. Notice that the Constitution's at the top, and connecting to the Constitution are each of the three branches. But when you get below the boxes that have the three branches and what they do, everything below that is connected only to the president. Okay, so this is an organizational chart of all of those parts of government that answer to the president to help him implement or enforce the law. That includes the 15 executive departments and the hundreds of agencies, boards, commissions, etc., that implement policy. There are some that you need to specifically be alerted to, because they are going to be on the exam potentially, because they're listed in the course and exam description. So the bureaucracy, if you needed a definition, is the unelected employees of the executive branch who carry out the daily operations of the federal government. So they're not elected. I think that's a really important aspect about the bureaucracy, because one of the questions that arises is there too much power and control in everyday matters by people that aren't elected? Some departments you need to know. The departments are sort of the largest parts and units of the executive branch. Ones that the College Board says you specifically need to know include these three that are on the page: Homeland Security, Transportation, and Education. Also, Veterans Affairs is another department that they want you to know, that I did not include, but that's also one that you need. There are then regulatory agencies and commissions. Now, these have a little distance. They are supposed to be politically distant from the president. They are the heads of the regulatory agencies and commissions are appointed by the president, but it's for a term of office. So they could span different presidents and different parties, because it's for a term of office. The ones that the course and exam description specifically say you need to know about include the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency. They've been in the news quite a bit after that derailment of the train spewing the toxic chemicals in Ohio. The FDA is not in the list, but we all know about them because of the pandemic we've just gone through, the Food and Drug Administration. The FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, they oversee and regulate election conduct. They've been in the news quite a bit. New Representative George Santos out of New York has been in the news a lot, because apparently he fabricated almost everything on his resume. But there's also some irregularities in the reports he's filed with the FEC about campaign finance and where his money came from. And so he's looking at some possible issues there. And in one of your court cases that you'll do in Unit 5 is Citizens United versus FEC. So you have a court case you're going to have to learn about the Federal Election Commission in. And then they've included the Securities and Exchange Commission in our list of what we need to know as well. So this is not SEC like football or basketball or whatever your favorite sport is. This is SEC as in Securities and Exchange Commission. And they regulate the stock market. And you may have learned about them in your economics class. So those are on the list of ones you need to know. There are also numerous boards, bureaus, and agencies, groups like the FBI. They are the U.S. Postal Service is a government corporation. They are in that hierarchy chart. They are up underneath a department in some way. Whereas the EPA, the FDA, the FEC, and the SEC, they're going to answer directly to the president, and they could answer to Congress as part of congressional oversight, but they're not answering to a department head because they're not part of one of the departments. Okay. And I will say the head of the EPA has cabinet rank authority. I don't remember which president first gave an EPA head cabinet rank authority. I think it might have been Bush the second. Let's see, 43. But the others are not cabinet rank. All right. Now, who works in these? There are civil service employees that work in the bureaucracy. These are many of them are career employees. This is their job for 30 years or whatever. They work for the IRS. They work for the State Department. They could be located anywhere in the world. We have offices around the world for many of our departments and certainly around the country. There is an intent that they are supposed to carry out their mission in a nonpartisan way. Okay, and there are various regulations that have been passed by Congress to ensure that, or try to ensure that they reduce corruption, they promote professionalism, and that they are acting in a nonpartisan way. Two of those include the Pendleton Act and the Hatch Act. I think what you really need to know about those is that they're intended to insulate the process of implementation of policy from politics. So it doesn't matter who the president is, the employees will still continue to implement the law in accordance with how Congress intends it for it to be implemented. Now, how do they do that? What kinds of jobs do they do? One of their tasks is writing and enforcing regulations. So Congress will write a law, but they don't always write the details of the law, like how it will be carried out. Sometimes Congress is super specific and they say, and this is going to be carried out by this agency or this department. Other times they leave it to the discretion and the discretionary authority of the president and of the bureaucracy. So, for instance, if they get a law about, can't think of it. I can think of one that they were very specific on off the top of my head. So like the healthcare law that we know as Obamacare, they actually were specific about who would be enforcing on that. And those members of Congress that don't like the law are probably really upset that they got super specific, because it led to a Supreme Court decision that the law was a tax and it was constitutional, because they said the IRS would do the enforcement of it. So that sort of defined the action as something different than the minority party, who were the Republicans, thought it would be. But often other times, maybe they'll write a law about pesticides. Well, that could be potentially implemented by the Agriculture Department. Maybe it could be implemented by the FDA. You know, there might be various places that you could implement that law. And if they don't put that in the law, then it's up to the president's discretion to assign it. And then the bureaucrats, the people that work in there, actually write the regulations that the industry has to follow. So they write and enforce those regulations. They might issue fines. So failure to follow it properly. My daughter's boyfriend works for Southern Company, with the big power company, and he is in nuclear. I don't know, actually, he's some kind of engineer, but he does nuclear power enforcement now. And so he's had to memorize like the book of federal regulations, because he has to go on site when they're doing maintenance and they have to shut things down. He has to be there and make sure that they're following all the rules that have been written by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, another regulatory commission, about safe operation. And if they don't follow the rules, then their company can be fined, and those can be very hefty fines because it's about public safety. So the bureaucracy often makes up the decisions about what those fines will be and what are the regulations that have to be followed. And I think that's appropriate, at least as far as making the regulations, because generally the bureaucracy is staffed with people that are expert in those areas. So like working for the nuclear regulatory agency are going to be people that are experts in nuclear power and in what could happen and what the safety things should be. Members of Congress can't be experts in everything. Okay. And then there's that oversight function of Congress. So members of the bureaucracy might have to testify before Congress and answer for the ways that they've carried out laws. They might have questions, maybe the intent is good when a law is written and the intent is good when the bureaucracy implements, but there are unintended consequences that are negative from the law. Constituents might complain to Congress and Congress says, well, let me get in the people who've written these regulations and let's talk to them and figure out what's wrong so that we can rewrite the law or modify the law so that we don't have these negative unintended consequences. So that's part of that oversight function that Congress can do with the bureaucracy. Now let's look and see if you can connect some of this. So here we've got some lists of these agencies along the sides, and we have some actual actions down the center. And I want you to do the same thing we did before. I want you to match it up. So for these 6 actions, and it's one per customer, well, one of these departments or agencies can do a couple of these things. But let's match them up to what you think they do. And as you look at this, if you're a little bit like, well, I'm just not sure, let some logic guide you. The College Board does not expect you to know every single task that any of these departments or agencies would do, but use a little common sense to try to decide what you think they could do. These are more examples of things you could write than they are things that you would see on the test. Now, let me explain what I meant when I just said that, so that it wouldn't be something you'd find. What you would see on the test might be something like, explain how the Department of Homeland Security implements laws for the security of the United States. That's where being able to come up with some kind of example that, and I'll just go ahead and show you the answer on that. Well, for them, it's going to be the top one. Can create administrative paperwork for anyone entering the country. So they're actually enforcing immigration law on that, and they're creating the papers you fill out. So if I want to apply for a visa to come and visit, whether it's a work visa, a student visa, or a tourist visa, they create the actual pieces of paper that the person seeking the visa is going to fill out. So knowing these kinds of examples can be helpful for you on the test if they say, explain how the bureaucracy does this. If you've got some ideas in your head, it helps you with that writing maybe to come up with specific examples, because just saying they write the rules is not going to earn you points. Okay, but getting a little more specific and naming a specific department or part of the bureaucracy can earn you points. When you might think you were saying exactly the same thing, but you just weren't being quite specific enough. Okay, so to show you an example here. All right, so here is Homeland Security, which I already mentioned, can create administrative paperwork for anyone entering the country. Providing information to the Education and Labor Committee about the status of the student loan program. That's most likely going to be done by the Department of Education because they oversee and administer the student loan program. Transportation department, those are the people that are over the highways and the airports and all of that. So they're connected to those infrastructure projects like roads and airports and things like that. So they're actually screening applications. Maybe I want to be the one who builds the road. That's what we're talking about here. And they award then the federal money to pay people when they win the bid for actually doing it. Veterans Affairs. One of the things they're going to do is they're going to provide information to veterans and their families about what kinds of benefits are available to them. They might provide job assistance. My daughter's mother-in-law is a retired Air Force veteran, and when she first came back to the U.S., she worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs, and that's one of the things she did was job placement and information for former servicemen. How do I translate the skills I learned in the military to the civilian workforce back at home and find a job? How do I make a resume? How do I translate this into a non-military setting? So the Department of Veterans Affairs hires people to do that sort of thing. The Federal Elections Commission, they can fine or sanction candidates if they violate the rules that have been written with regard to keeping our elections fair. And then when this was initially written, the intent was 1-to-1 because there's 6 actions and 6 departments or agencies. And so the EPA was tied to the overseeing of disbursement of money from the Superfund. The Superfund is a special fund that was created that if you are found guilty of being negligent and causing the environmental harm as a company, then you have to pay money into the Superfund, and the Superfund is what it's what reimburses people that have been harmed from it. So for instance, was it BP that was responsible for the spill in the Gulf like a decade ago or so now? And they had to they had to pay for the cleanup and pay for the harm. So like people that fish out of the Gulf, they had loss of income for quite a while because it wasn't safe for fish. It would be toxic for us to eat the fish. So they could, they had
an industry.
Right. And so they had to pay that. And like some of that was paid to the state, and people applied then to the state for reimbursement. With the train derailment in Ohio that's recently happened, there's a lot of talk. The president I was just grading current events before this started, and some of my students had written about that. They have to connect it to something we're learning in class. And they talked about how President Biden has talked about, we're going to investigate. And if, is it Norfolk Southern, if they're found to have not followed safe rules for transport of those chemicals, if they've done something that would have led to that spill, they would then potentially have to pay into the Superfund, not only to clean up the spill, but also there might be health concerns for those people for a long time that are going to cost money. They have to do that sort of thing. So it's the EPA that would oversee that. Okay. And so when this was first written, that was the only place the EPA was intended to connect up to. But as we sometimes find out when we use these presentations with students and we talk to students, that there are other things too. And so the EPA also, sometimes they deal with critical infrastructure projects because of how they might impact the environment. And they are part of this process of awarding grants and screening applicants as well, which I had a student use that and argue for it. And I did a little research and I said, you know what, they are. Now, is that important? Or you're not going to have to identify something like this on a test. But these are some examples. We wanted to put examples in front of you so that if you're faced with a question like that on the test, you've got something in your brain that you can say, oh yeah, here's an example of the specific kinds of things they might do. Just tie it to the department you're talking about. So like, this provide information to the Education and Labor Committee about the status of the student loan program. If you were talking about transportation, you could just change it to the Transportation Committee in the House about the status of funds distributed for the building or repair of a highway. You could just kind of change that a little bit. The important point is, what do? They provide information. They create this paperwork and regulations. They fine or sanction candidates, screen applicants. It's those actions that you would need to be able to write about on the test. Nobody's asking questions. I hope that's because you don't have any. All right. So who else is involved in this process? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you have questions and you don't want to ask it out loud, and you put it in the chat, like I can answer you there too.
Okay, that'd be great. So who else influences policymaking? You probably, if you're not to Unit 5 yet, you may not have gone in depth yet with linkage institutions. But linkage institutions are those institutions that are not government, but are related to government. Their job is to connect the people to government. Okay, so they're to link us. They include the media. They include political parties, interest groups, and we the people. Okay, elections and the public are, we generally reflect this public opinion and pressure through those elections as a linkage institution, but we can also do it through our participation in discussion with interest groups, in discussing things with the media and bringing things to the media's attention, or with the political parties themselves, which ultimately, of course, we vote for members of political parties to hold office, and then they actually enact whatever agenda there is. Now, all can be influential in the policymaking system. So one of the books that is commonly used, this graphic, some of the teachers are looking at going, yep, I've seen that graphic before. This was, I know, in the Edwards book, which I used for a long time, and I think something similar is probably in other ones. But this sort of shows the circular and cyclical nature of policymaking. So you have the people have their interests, their concerns, their problems. They get those, they communicate those to the linkage institutions who get it put on the policy agenda. And then you have the writing of policy, the debating of it, the final rejection or passage, one or the other. Then the policy gets implemented, and that affects us. And sometimes it affects us positively, and we give them great feedback. Hey, this was great. Thank you for passing this. Pass more like it. Or sometimes we say, hey, this has really harmed us. I know, you may not have meant for it to harm us, but it has harmed us. Change it. And then it kind of starts all over again. What I want you to do, and many of you are already doing it, you can do it by circling, dots, whatever, but I want some color coding here. Red for legislative, blue for executive, and green for the people. In which part, you've got 6 parts of this cycle, in which parts is the legislative most influential? In which parts is the executive most influential? And in which are the people most influential? And all 3 of those categories are going to go in more than one section. So there's some sections will have multiple dots or multiple circles or multiple whatever, however you color code it. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. There are some creative ways that you guys are doing it. Whatever makes the most sense to you. I've got circles, I've got highlighting, I've got dots, lines. All right, so I'm going to show you an example so I can, we can talk about it. If you're still marking things, you can keep marking things, but I want us to have a little more practice with some writing here in just a second. And I just looked at the clock and said, whoops, we don't have a lot more time. So we've got green dots for the people in the sections that say people, of course, but also in the linkage institutions, because linkage institutions are made up of people. And they are usually expressing the interests and the desires of the people. And then you've got it in the policymaking institutions, because interest groups and political parties, which are made up of the people, are very influential in the actual drafting of policy and in the implementation of policy. So they're under the policy. And I guess the green dot could actually, it could actually be everywhere, because setting the policy agenda is often done by the parties as well. And you've got the people involved through that process. So we really should have green dots in every section. Now, the legislative branch itself gets involved once you get to the policy agenda in the policymaking institutions themselves, and then in their oversight of how the policy gets implemented. So they're still in that policy section. And then the executive branch is in those three places as well. They're part of setting the agenda. They are trying to influence the policy while it's being made, particularly through their work through iron triangles or issue networks. And then, of course, the executive branch is primarily responsible for the implementation of policy. Any questions about that? All right, let's look at a scenario. And what I would like you to do here, I want you to read, and I want you to underline or highlight one action, an action that you see by interest groups, one action by the legislature or legislative branch, one action by the executive branch. And I want us to use the same color coding we just used. So I'm going to stick it in the chat, but it's green for interest groups, red for legislative branch, and blue for executive branch. And just one action for each. Thank you, Ms.
I put it in
Waddell.
the chat.
Yeah, you beat me to it. So
I was
green for
typing as you
interest
said it.
groups, red for legislative, blue for executive. And just in the interest of time, just one of each. All right, so showing some examples. Here's one You've got the AMA giving money to members of Congress. That actually should be green because the American Medical Association is not part of the government. They're an interest group. Okay, so you got your color coding a little bit backwards on this one, but that's okay. Red, Congress passed the Hunger Free Kids Act of 2010 and the Richard B. Russell National School Lunch Act. That is a legislative action. And then once it was passed, the USDA created and implemented regulations. That should be blue. So we got the blue and the green mixed up on this one, but you have looked at specific examples, which is what I wanted you to do. Okay. Here's another one. Okay. These actions have been prompted by demands from medical professional groups such as the American Medical Association. So you got the AMA making demands, then you've got the Department of Agriculture. This one actually is sort of a description of what they're under pressure to do. You don't have an actual action here, but you do have a motivation for why they will take the action. All right. And then Congress passes those two laws. And the laws appropriate funding, okay, which of course you can't do any law without the funding, all right? And then here's another one. This one has all the actions, okay? You were asked just to identify one, but take a moment and look at all the different things in this scenario. This scenario is slightly longer than the kind of scenario you'll get from the College Board. Theirs won't be quite this long. Okay. It'll be condensed, but being able to pick out specific actions taken by different groups of people can be important. So I'm going to give you a test taking tip. Mark it up. You've got lots of time to write on this test, more time than most students use. I know Miss Smith is also a scorer, as is Miss Waddell and Miss Waldscott. I'm not sure about the others, but they can tell you we see an awful lot of blank space, drawings, obvious representations that students did not use as much time as they had. And unfortunately, for many of those students, their answers aren't as complete as they should be either. So if you take the time to highlight, or you don't have a highlighter, you got a pencil, but to mark up your scenario, outline your answer before you ever start writing, you're gonna have a clearer writing sample and you're gonna probably earn more points. Okay, because you're gonna be really clear on what you want to say before you start writing it. Okay, so in this example, a little longer than they will be, you've got multiple examples for each branch of actions that they do. We wanted to provide you with this kind of a sample so that you could sit and play with it and say, now, how could I use this then in my writing? Here's another view of the sample. You may or may not have talked very much about iron triangles. Iron triangles are those sort of close actions that and relationships that occur between the congressional committees, an interest group, and the bureaucracy who's in charge of implementation. And so on this graphic, we've taken the actual actions from that scenario on the last slide, and we've slotted it into this iron triangle with the actions going from who's doing it and who it's directed to. Okay, and I wanted this to be available to you guys. You're going to get this takeaway back and you'll have this to study to put the scenario with the iron triangle and think, how does this all fit together? And hopefully maybe the teachers can use this if they haven't taught iron triangles yet. This might be a really good example for you to just sit down and see how it all slots together with a real example. Okay, so how will this show up on the test? This information can obviously show up in multiple choice questions. Unit 2 has always the information about the 3 branches together with how they make policy has always been up to about 50% or a little more of the exam, even before it was redesigned. Okay, and that makes sense because the bulk of the Constitution is about the 3 branches and their powers and what they can do. And when you add in the politics component and you add in the interest groups and how they influence, et cetera, you've got a lot of the content of the exam. And I'm not on the test development committee and I don't know what's on the test, but I can almost guarantee at least one of the question of your FRQs is going to somehow deal with policymaking and implementation in some way. Okay, because that's just typical. And the concept application really lends itself to this. So in the concept, and you're going to practice one in just a second here. The concept application FRQ is going to give you a stimulus. It will be a shorter stimulus than the one you just saw. And usually the first thing they're going to ask you to do in the A portion is to identify or describe something specific that's in the scenario. When College Board gives you some kind of stimulus, they want proof you read it or you looked at it. And they're going to ask you basically quote some information back from it to prove to them that you have looked at it. Your second task may have one verb or two. It could have either. And it may ask you to describe something and then explain how or why this reflects a principle or process of government. It might say something like, in the context of the scenario. If you see that language, in the context of the scenario, oh, please make sure you use something that's specifically in the scenario. I have scored a concept application before, and I have had to not give students credit because they didn't mention any language from the scenario. And it can be as simple as, on that last example, as simple as mentioning the American Medical Association, because that was one of the actors in the scenario. And that tells me you mentioned them. As long as it wasn't in the prompt too, mentioning something that's not in the prompt, but is in the scenario, that gets you that little in the context of the scenario. You prove that you looked at the scenario. And then the last task will also usually be one verb, but could potentially be two. That's going to ask you to describe or explain something in relation usually to another unit of study. So they tend to cross units. So if the main question was about something in unit 2, then they're going to pull in something maybe from unit 1 or unit 5, maybe, any of the other units is going to be pulled in. And they're going to want you to demonstrate that you understand how these other aspects of government and politics would impact what's happening in the scenario. Okay. And you should assume in every part that it's a good idea to reference the scenario in your answer. Okay. So let's try a concept application question. All right. This is also about school lunches, but it's a little bit different. Okay. So, you've got ABC prompts, read the scenario, and then respond to A, B, and C. Now, I know I'm right up against the edge of my time, and I apologize for that. And I will tell you, I'm going to put this in student pace mode. On the next slide is a link to the survey on this. And so if you need to go, which I've gotten a couple messages from students that need to leave, if you need to go, please fill out the survey first. And then plan to come back to this and practice this concept application FRQ. And I actually will not close this for a couple of hours. So I'll leave it open so that you could come back and write on this slide if you need to leave. But you still want to give that practice to your teacher. But I will close it. Let's say I'll close it before I go to bed tonight. I usually go to bed between 9 and 10. So I will close it before then, but I will keep it open so that you can come back and write if you need to leave. Those of you that can stick around a few more minutes and write, I'll be happy to give you some feedback on your writing. For any of those students still in here, if you have questions or want us to specifically comment on your writing, we'd be happy to do that. You just need to tell us.
Have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you. You too. For those of you still in here, please remember to fill out the survey as well.